Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, a publishing division of the Association of College and Research Libraries. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Gale, publisher of 18th Century Collections Online, Part 3. For more than 2 decades, 18th Century Collections Online has been a foundation of global scholarship on the long 18th century, giving researchers access to millions of pages of books, pamphlets, and rare print that shaped the modern world. Now, with ECCO Part 3, those collections are expanding again with 1.7 million pages of new primary sources, including rare and unique miniature books newly digitized for the very first time. This new collection provides researchers with new perspectives on print culture, literacy, craftsmanship, and everyday life in the 1700s. To learn more and request trial access for your library, visit gale.com/echo-3. Again, that's gale.com/ECCO-III. In this series, we're taking a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at how primary sources are brought to life in a digital research environment. More specifically, we'll travel back in time to the 18th century when a unique publication format was all the rage: tiny books. Joining me for this series is Eleanor Lease, Acquisitions Editor for Gale Primary Sources, who explains for us what tiny books are and the careful process of digitizing them for the ECCO Part 3 platform. We'll talk about identification, handling, and imaging techniques, as well as how Gale collaborated with libraries to bring these delicate materials into a contemporary research platform. In this first episode of our series, we learn about Eleanor's work and the ECCO platform, including its context and impact on primary source scholarship. Okay, Eleanor, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what you do there at Gale. So, what is your role?
So at Gale Primary Sources, we publish digital archives, and I'm an acquisitions editor, which means I commission and acquire digital archives. So I work with libraries and archives to identify their collections, which ones might be suitable to create a digital archive. And then I work with them to shape the archive, decide what we want to include, what has most research value to create a product.
Hmm. So these are already digitized, or you're looking for collections that need to be digitized, or both?
Generally, the latter. So
Yeah.
we find that things that have most research value
Hmm.
are ones
Hmm.
that aren't currently available digitally. So we either work digitizing from the original items, or sometimes we work from microfilm sets and digitize from microfilm,
Okay. Excellent.
depending on the nature of the product.
Right. Briefly, like what goes, you mentioned shaping the collection. Like what
Mm.
are some of the decisions that go into that?
Gosh, lots of decisions. So one of them is how available something already is online. When we're looking at the research value, we're thinking about who our end user is, which is often academic researchers, as opposed to people using different archives who might be interested in like family histories. Generally,
Hmm.
genealogical information's not as interesting or as useful to our users, our researchers. So we might
Right.
exclude something like that,
Hmm.
which is of less value to
Right.
academic researchers. And also, for instance, if we were putting together a global product, we would want to ensure sort of broad coverage rather than having all of the material come from one country,
Yeah.
for
Excellent.
instance. So there are lots of things that come into play depending on the type of archive that we're trying to put together.
Right. And then are you do you tend to be sort of the proactive one in this arrangement, or are libraries coming to you as well?
It works both ways. So
Yeah.
sometimes we will identify sort of a need for our users by talking to people at conferences, by looking at sort of up and coming topics that are getting more and more academic, scholarly attention.
Hmm.
Sometimes our partners will come to us and say, we've got this brilliant collection that's got loads of research value. People are using it, but the number of people who can use it is limited by geography or conservation, or there might be sort of any number of reasons why it's difficult to use the physical artifacts. So that
Right.
can be a good candidate for digitization.
Excellent. So it's been 20 years since ECCO launched. What inspired that original collection?
So ECCO grew out of a couple of earlier projects. So in the 1970s, there was an effort to create a short title catalogue of everything that was published in England and its territories. I'm being careful about terminology.
Hmm.
England, its colonies and territories, as were. Um, and a portion of that became the 18th century English short title catalogue. So that's the catalogue that ECCO, 18th Century Collections Online, is based on. So the short title catalogue, the ESTC, led to a microfilm collection called the 18th Century. And then in the early 2000s, Gale began digitizing that microfilm collection. So it's really, you see sort of the culmination of all these different technologies
Yeah.
that lead to ECCO. So it was one of the first really large scale digital archives of its kind.
Oh,
Um, and it really transformed the way that 18th century research could be done, because for a start it unified these titles that are held all over the world. You can access them in one place and you can read them as if you were seeing the physical artifact at the page level, but also you can do distant reading projects, the
hmm,
sort of field of study that is now known as digital humanities. So looking at the corpus as a whole, looking at word frequencies, looking at titles, and those sorts of digital humanities projects grew out of projects like ECCO, which made that data available for the first time.
yeah. So that having collections like that have really had an impact on 18th century research, for example. I mean,
Yeah, it's interesting how the access to the archive has shaped the research, and then the
yeah.
research that has happened has shaped how we've come back to the archive as we've updated it.
Hmm.
So the archive has changed sort of in quite significant ways as it's evolved. Originally, it was very heavy on the traditional English canon. So when they were doing the original microfilming project, the first part of ECCO is 26 million pages. It's enormous. Um,
Wow.
but even at that size, they made really significant choices about what was going to be included. For instance, only including one edition of each title,
Hmm.
apart from a small number of authors, such as Samuel Johnson, Jonathan Swift, where they would include multiple editions. But those sorts of choices reinforced that canon, kept marginalized voices marginalized.
Mm.
And then as the project has grown and evolved over the years, we've sort of undone some of those choices. And so now we include all of the editions that we can find and feasibly capture. So it's really interesting how choices like that have sort of changed how the 18th century is studied, but also the type of research and the type of research materials that scholars want access to
Yeah.
have altered how we update the archive.
Hmm. Excellent. So now we're on part three of Echo.
We are.
Yeah. So what's that? What's involved there? What new gaps is it filling?
Well, there's a few reasons why we wanted to update Echo. So part three is coming in March of next year. It's not been updated since 2009. The first reason is that the English short title catalogue is never finished. We've never found and catalogued everything that was printed in the 18th century. So as the catalogue has updated, titles then become eligible for inclusion in ECCO. So partly it's just that we've found new stuff and want to include it. Also because the first parts of ECCO were from the microfilm project. Anything that couldn't be microfilmed was therefore excluded from ECCO. And that tended to be things that were either too large to be filmed, so a lot of the broadsides, Acts of Parliament, anything printed in a really large format, or in very small format, so miniature books, were excluded from that simply because they couldn't be microfilmed, and then the microfilms didn't exist to create digital from. So we have gone back and tried to capture as much of that as possible. And also because color imaging is now much more available, we have scanned in color. So a lot of the highly illustrated works now included. We've also included covers and spines, which we can talk a bit more about later, so that we've tried to capture the book as an object as well as a text to try and reunite those, because that has a huge impact on how scholars and researchers can use ECCO.
Yeah. Speaking of that, can you just kind of talk about who is using ECCO today, and sort of the various types of scholarship behind that?
Yeah, so ECCO's its main users historically and still have been historians of the 18th century, literary scholars of the 18th century.
Right.
But we see ECCO being used across the academy. So we had an impact study conducted by Mike Thelwall at Sheffield University, and that showed Scopus citations, so scholarly citations of ECCO in every single major subject area, so including the sciences and engineering and aeronautics. It really is used by everybody because in the 18th century, the arts and the sciences didn't have the same sort of distinctions and siloing that you do now. You can trace so many political and economic ideas back to sort of their roots in the 18th century. So it really is being used across the board.
You just heard from Eleanor Lease, Acquisitions Editor for Gale Primary Sources. Join us next week when we discuss the tiny book format in more detail, including what they were used for, why they were previously difficult to find and research, and the ways scholars can now analyze the texts. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Gale, publisher of 18th Century Collections Online, Part 3. For more than 2 decades, 18th Century Collections Online has been a foundation of global scholarship on the long 18th century, giving researchers access to millions of pages of books, pamphlets, and rare print that shaped the modern world. Now with ECCO Part 3, those collections are expanding again with 1.7 million pages of new primary sources, including rare and unique miniature books newly digitized for the very first time. This new collection provides researchers with new perspectives on print culture, literacy, craftsmanship, and everyday life in the 1700s. To learn more and request trial access for your library, visit gale.com/ECCO-3. Again, that's gale.com/ECCO-III. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by Choice and produced and edited by digital media producer Sabrina Kofer. Underwriting opportunities are directed by Melissa Carr and Ryan King. For more information about sponsorship opportunities, download the Choice Media Kit at choice360.org. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.